What's a creepy true story you have that still haunts you to this day? Story 1. This happened to a friend of mine about a year ago. Minji is in her late 20s and works as an English tutor in South Korea. One evening, a few years back, she was tutoring a high school boy. They studied until quite late, and by then the buses had stopped running. Since his home was a long way off, the boy asked if he could sleep on her floor and catch the first bus in the morning. Minji was hesitant, since having a teenage male student spend the night felt inappropriate, but he pleaded with her until she gave in. They returned to her small one-room apartment. She went to bed while he laid a blanket on the floor, and they both eventually fell asleep. A few hours later, at around 2 in the morning, the boy shook Minji awake. "I'm really hungry," he said. "Let's go get some food." Minji blinked at him in disbelief. "Food? Now. It's 2 in the morning. Go back to sleep." But he persisted. "No, I'm so hungry. Let's eat something now." She told him there was some ramen in the kitchen, and he could make himself a bowl. That didn't satisfy him. He didn't want ramen. There was a 24-hour place just down the road, and he insisted they go there. After several minutes of persuasion, Minji gave in. They left the apartment together. As soon as they stepped onto the street, the boy turned to her and said quietly, "I'm not hungry. I woke up in the middle of the night and looked under your bed. A man is sleeping there." They called the police and discovered that a homeless man had been living in Minji's apartment, sleeping under her bed, for over 2 months. The boy had only noticed him because he was lying on the floor and had a clear view beneath the bed. The police arrested the man, and thankfully, nothing else happened. Still, it remains the creepiest experience anyone I know has ever gone through. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. When I was younger, I had an imaginary friend who lived inside a massive antique dresser. We would hang out together, and I vividly remember him telling me stories, though I have no memory of what they were. One day, I mentioned him to my parents. My dad traveled often, so he wasn't always up to date on what I was into. When I told him about my dresser friend, he asked what his name was. It was something simple like Peter or Patrick, but I can still picture my dad's face turning completely pale. I even drew Peter or Patrick for my dad, and the very next day he and my uncle hauled the dresser outside and burned it. It wasn't until a few years later that I learned my dad's younger brother had also known the same friend with the same name, living in that same antique dresser. At first it was the usual imaginary friend routine, but after a few months, my uncle began having night terrors and couldn't sleep because of Peter or Patrick. It got so bad they eventually had to move him out of his room before he finally returned to normal. The dresser was an old, dark wooden thing, ugly and imposing. From what we know, it had belonged to my great-great-grandfather, who, according to family history, was into some strange things. My dad never spoke about what was actually inside the dresser, but he had been the only one to believe his brother back then. Their parents dismissed it, thinking kids were just being kids, and who really believed in ghosts at the time. It must have been a shock then, when nearly 30 years later, his own son ended up with the same friend. My uncle's night terrors stopped once they moved him to another room. The bedroom with the dresser was turned into a small sitting room since it had nice views, and it stayed mostly unused until my dad moved our family into that house and that room became mine. I haven't seen my uncle in 14 years, and we don't really talk since he lives on the other side of the world. I'm reluctant to bring this up with him, knowing he struggles with depression and alcoholism, and I'd hate to add more to his burden. I remember Peter, or Patrick, looking like a tiny old man. Not tiny in the sense of being shrunken with age, but small child-sized. He had very large hands with long, thin fingers, and that detail has stuck with me so much that even today, whenever I draw people, the hands always end up longer and larger than they should be. He smelled of wood, mothballs, old clothes, and what I now recognize as mold. Story 3. I should start by saying my brother isn't just a military man. He's your typical hetero never let them see you cry cliché of a Marine. He's not afraid of much, except apparently the entire country of Japan. This is his story. My brother joined the Marines when he was 18 and was stationed in Japan. He enjoyed his time there for a while, especially the social scene. He made friends with some Japanese men his age who worked around the base. On nights when he and his fellow soldiers had time off, the locals would show them around, take them to bars, and introduce them to girls. One night, after a bit of drinking and no luck with the girls, the local guy invited my brother to his home to play video games. My brother accepted, and they spent a few hours gaming. During that time, the man told my brother the main reason he wanted to get home early. His little sister had been suffering from night terrors, which caused her to wake up screaming, crying, and sometimes vomiting. He was worried about her and wanted to be home in case she had an episode. At this point, I should explain the layout of the guy's house. It was built in the shape of a horseshoe, with a garden in the middle. His bedroom was at the very end of one side of the U, while his sister's rooms were all the way at the other end. Essentially, they were across the garden from each other. From his window, he could see into theirs, and vice versa. Anyway, they decided to call it a night, and the Japanese guy walked over to the window to check on his sister across the garden. He lifted the blind and peered out for just a fraction of a second before jumping back, screaming and staring at my brother as if he had seen something terrible. My brother went to look, but the man stopped him. He said he had seen a dark cloud with red eyes hovering over his sister's sleeping body. Naturally, my brother didn't believe him and decided to see for himself. He crept quietly over to the window and lifted the blind, only to come face to face with what he described as a dark black puff of smoke with a face. Both my brother and the other guy admit that they crawled under the blankets and stayed there until morning, too afraid to lift them. The smoky figure had drifted a little closer and was in the room with them, just on the other side of the thin sheets. I don't know what to believe or whether they might have drunk more than they admitted that night and imagined it all, but I know my brother believes what he saw. He sticks to his story, and when he tells it, he looks like someone who has witnessed something truly sinister. Story 4. My school's library is open until around 2 in the morning for people like me who leave their essays to the last minute. It's a fairly small building and most of the books are in the basement area called the stacks. To give you a quick layout, there are the main stairs that go down to the stacks, a vending machine room, and a long hallway with 4 entrances into the stacks. The stacks themselves consist of 2 very large rooms on opposite sides of the hallway, filled with bookshelves and study desks lining the walls. I was there around 11 p.m. last year. It was a pretty research-intensive essay, so I stayed in the stacks working at one of the study desks to avoid constantly going upstairs and downstairs. I had been there for maybe 2 hours, and everyone except for a boy a few desks down had already left. By this point, I was pretty zoned out. It was for an 8 a.m. class, so I didn't have much time until it was due, and I was starting to panic. I got really annoyed when I heard someone flipping through book pages rapidly, making that loud whirring noise at the other end of the room. I tried to ignore it for a while, thinking they'd stop eventually, but they just kept going. After about 5 minutes, I got sick of it and started walking over to tell them to knock it off. I got about 3 steps across the room and it suddenly stopped. I sat back down and it stayed quiet for about 10 more minutes before the page flipping started again. Much louder this time, like they had grabbed a huge book. The boy a few desks down started getting annoyed too. He stood up and began walking through the bookshelves, trying to find the source. It kept going, so I got up and started looking with him. The noise grew very loud and it became pretty obvious where it was coming from. He was on one side of the shelves and I was on the other. We walked all the way down the shelves. No one was there. We hadn't seen anyone enter the stacks, and we were on the side of the room with the entrances. There was no way anyone could have come in without us seeing them. The noise stopped again, and we both slowly walked back to our seats. I assumed it was just a fan or something in the other room, and I really needed to finish my essay. We sat down, and immediately the noise started again. This time, it sounded like it was coming from right next to the boy's chair. He shoved his stuff into his bag, looked at me, said, "Screw this," and took off. I followed maybe 5 seconds later. I still won't go back into the stacks at night, even when there are other people down there. Story 5. About 4 years ago, I was sleeping when I woke up suddenly to see a person standing next to my bed. The person was clearly female but very petite, perhaps a teenager or just small in stature. She was facing away from me, her shoulder cocked up to her cheek, like someone holding a phone. Her hair was tied in a low ponytail. There was nothing surreal or ghostly about her. She looked exactly as a person would if you woke in a dark room, dimly lit by moonlight. There was no mistaking that someone was standing only a couple of feet from my bed. I jolted upright immediately. Shock is putting it mildly. My heart was pounding like a drum. The worst part was that she heard me sit up and reacted, turning her crooked head to face me as if she were just as surprised to see me as I was to see her. I was so scared that I actually closed my eyes, like in the movies, hoping that when I opened them she would be gone, and I could chalk it up to some half-dreaming state. Nope. She was still there, staring at me. I fumbled for the lamp on my nightstand. It felt like forever. I couldn't take my eyes off her. I was so nervous that any sound I made might make her come closer. When I finally switched on the lamp, she was gone. I called my boyfriend, hysterically crying and begging him to come over. He refused, insisting that I hadn't actually seen what I thought I had. I ended up sleeping with the light on for 3 whole weeks. I was that scared. The next day, I told my mom what had happened, and she advised me to search every closet in my apartment for squatters, which felt even more terrifying than seeing a ghost. Story 6. About 7 years ago, my friends and I were driving home from a show in the Cerritos area. We were all 16, joking and laughing like teenagers do. As we passed a local elementary school somewhere near 186th Street, my friend's girlfriend suddenly looked over at the playground, screamed, and went completely silent. For hours, she wouldn't talk to anyone. We kept asking what she saw, what had happened, but nothing could get her to say a word. We all assumed she'd seen someone, or maybe even a body on the playground. Whatever it was, it had seriously spooked her. I should mention, she's always been sensitive to paranormal things. I don't really believe in ghosts or anything like that, but she would have doors flying open in her old house, clothes hangers slipping off the rail, and cups tipping over and then righting themselves multiple times. Eventually, she told her boyfriend what she had seen that night. She said she had caught a brief glimpse of a group of blood-covered people wandering aimlessly around the playground. I immediately chalked it up to exhaustion. It was around 2 a.m. after all. Later, we looked it up, and it turns out a plane had crashed into that school in the late 80s, and many people had perished. It was a chilling coincidence, to say the least. Story 7. About 2 weeks after I was born, my dad's best friend Jim passed away. They were very close, and one of his last wishes was to hold me for a little while before he went. That wish was fulfilled, and shortly after, he was gone. Fast forward 7 years. I was a happy 7-year-old with a 5-year-old brother and a recently born sister. One day, the phone rang. With my mom out and dad in the bathroom, I assumed it would be ignored, since we kids were still too young to answer. But my brother broke the rules and picked up. He said, "Hello?" At this point, my dad had come out of the bathroom and asked my brother to hand him the phone. My brother ignored him and kept listening. Before Dad could ask again, my brother hung up, looked at him, and said, "Jim says hi and he misses Skywing Nova," then went back to playing. The look of shock on my dad's face is what I remember most. Story 8. A few years ago, I went to a Christmas party. That night, my housemates went home early, but I decided to stay and soak up the Christmas spirit with a few other friends. I ended up getting pretty hammered and didn't get home until around 3 a.m. Instead of going straight to bed, I grabbed another beer and stepped out onto the back porch to have a smoke and admire the stars. I'd been outside for a couple of minutes when I noticed a light turn on in the kitchen. My housemate appeared, looked at me from inside, and I waved, probably looking like a drunk idiot. I assumed he was coming out to debrief me on the rest of the evening. There had been some good laughs that weren't relevant to this story, but he just grabbed a glass of water and went back to bed. I finished my smoke and my beer and finally went inside myself. The next morning, we were rehashing the previous night when my housemate said something that sent chills down my spine. "Who came back from the party with you last night?" he asked. I gave him a sideways look. "No one, dude. I was out there alone." He shook his head. "Nah, man. There was someone out there with you behind you on the porch when you were looking inside, waving. I didn't come out because I thought it was some random friend from the Christmas party. I didn't know and I couldn't be bothered making introductions." To this day, he stands by that version of events. Whoever it was must have been standing close behind me the entire time. I saw no one. I heard nothing. Even now, thinking about it still gives me the willies. Story 9. My wife's mother passed away in 2003 from cancer. After the funeral, family and friends gathered at her house for a final celebration of her life. The gathering went late into the evening, and my son, who was 3 at the time, needed to go to bed. I walked with him up the stairs to where he would sleep. The room where my mother-in-law had passed was upstairs, straight down the hallway from the top of the landing. My son and I walked up together, holding hands. As we neared the top of the stairs, he stopped and refused to move further, right at the point where he could just see down the hallway. He was staring straight ahead. I looked where he was looking and saw an open doorway leading into a completely dark bedroom. He wouldn't move. I asked, "Buddy, are you okay?" He replied, "Daddy, the light scares me." I looked again down the hallway. "Buddy, do you see a light?" "Yes, Daddy, it scares me." I promptly picked him up and went back downstairs. To this day, the hairs still stand on the back of my neck when I think about it. Story 10. One of my brothers worked security at one of New York City's most upscale hotels. During one of his night shifts, the security desk received a frantic call. A man was panicking because his wife was in the bath and not breathing. My brother and another security guard rushed upstairs to the room. Sure enough, they found a woman in the tub, unresponsive. They got her out of the tub and began CPR. While they were attempting resuscitation, the NYPD arrived. The officers told my brother to stop CPR, saying the woman was clearly not alive and, in their opinion, had not been for a couple of hours. The husband was questioned extensively. He told law enforcement that he and his wife had fought earlier that evening. He went out on his own, and when he returned, his wife was in the bath. He said he went to bed at that point, but later became concerned when she didn't come to bed. Privately among those present, the general consensus was that the husband had something to do with it, though it could not be proven. A couple of weeks later, the room was made available to guests again, though the previous incident was of course not mentioned. A woman who frequently stayed at the hotel reserved the room for a week and was the first guest to occupy it since the event. The next morning, she came to the front desk, very upset, with all her luggage in tow. She said she was canceling the rest of her stay and would never return to the hotel. She claimed she had not slept a single minute all night and that the room was haunted. No one at the hotel had told her about what had previously happened in that room. While my brother worked there, every guest who stayed in the room reported strange occurrences, and many asked to be moved to another room. Story 11. A few years ago, my brother kept getting calls on his cell phone around 2 to 3 a.m. every night. When he answered, there was this horrifying noise like static mixed with screams. After a month of this, he changed his number, and the calls stopped. But then, about a week later, it started again. Same noise, same time, every night. Eventually, he decided to backdial the number. It led to an old man who seemed completely unaware of what was going on. Still, the calls kept coming. And if my brother didn't answer, the calls would come again, a few times in a row. No messages were ever left. He finally decided he'd had enough. He ended his contract with his phone company, switched to a new one, and got a new number. You guessed it. The screaming static calls started again after a short delay. By this point, he was terrified every night, completely baffled as to why this was happening. He backdialed the number again and reached a different person this time. Around that same period, he lost his job and with it, his phone. Naturally, the calls stopped once his phone was disconnected. Then one day, my mom asked me to listen to a strange message she'd received on our home phone. It was the same horrifying static screaming sound. We showed it to my brother and he freaked out. He backdialed the number one last time it was disconnected. After that, we never heard from it again. Story 12. About 12 years ago, I was at a friend's house. We were in the basement watching TV when his mom's boyfriend came down the stairs and told us to keep it down. Confused, we looked at each other. Our TV wasn't even on loud. We told him we weren't yelling, and he asked, "You aren't yelling?" We shook our heads. He gave a sort of hun look and explained that he and my friend's mom had heard someone screaming coming up from the furnace vents, so they thought it was coming from the basement. We hadn't heard anything, and we were about 15 feet away from the furnace. My friend and another friend said they were upstairs in the kitchen one night, hanging out when they heard a scream clear as day coming from one of the furnace vents. Naturally, it freaked them out. I never got to hear it myself. It was probably just metal creaking, but it was strange that we were so close to the furnace and didn't hear anything that could be mistaken for a scream. Story 13. When I was about 16, my little brother, who was 6 at the time, started telling me about a rabbit that came to visit him. I brushed it off, assuming it was just his imagination. But over the next few days, it was all he talked about. He said the rabbit would open a hole in the wall and that he would leave his body and go through it. The rabbit would show him places and tell him things that once he returned, he could never quite remember. I just told him he was probably dreaming it all up. That night, I heard scratching on the wall in my room. I looked around but couldn't find anything that could be making the noise, so I figured it was either something outside or maybe a mouse in the wall. But the sound just kept getting louder. Eventually, I got dressed and went outside to check, only to find nothing there. When I came back, the scratching was still going. I hit the wall a few times, hoping to scare off whatever it was. The noise stopped for a few seconds, then started again. It went on until around 3 in the morning, and then it stopped completely. The next morning at breakfast, my little brother didn't mention the rabbit at all. As relieved as I was not to hear about it, something about the silence felt off. I asked him, "Didn't the bunny see you last night?" What he said still sends chills down my spine. He replied, "He didn't take me anywhere last night. He said he was trying to see you, but you wouldn't let him in. He said you tried to hit him." After that, I started asking questions about the bunny. All my brother would say was that it took him to different places and told him secrets, things he would forget once he returned. The bunny wasn't really a bunny either. He supposedly looked like the guy from Donnie Darko, but more realistic, and the movie hadn't even been released yet. The visit stopped after another week. When the bunny tried to get my brother to come live with him, my brother said no. He wanted to stay with his mommy and daddy. The bunny has never come back. Sadly, my little brother passed away 10 years later. Story 14. We used to own a racetrack in Ohio, but we lived in southeast Pennsylvania. To get there in a reasonable amount of time, you had to take the turnpike. On one trip, my mother, my sister, and I were together, heading to meet my stepdad, who was driving separately with a trailer to haul equipment. We exited the turnpike after paying a toll and drove into a strip mall with a bunch of rinky-dink looking buildings. They weren't dirty, just faded pastel colors, and it didn't even look like there was a town nearby. There was a diner though, and since we hadn't eaten in the 4 hours since we left, we decided to stop in. The food was terrible, completely tasteless, and people stared at us the entire time. It wasn't dark like a cave, but there weren't many windows, just enough for some ambient light. It felt like a Denny's if the power went out, that sort of atmosphere. We also noticed an unreasonable number of people had bandages on them. The only person who spoke to us was the girl who took our order and later rang us up. We decided it wasn't worth eating there. Instead, we wrote down the exit in a little journal we kept in the glove compartment so we'd know never to make the same mistake again. A couple of hours later, we arrived at the track, and my stepdad asked how everything had gone. We said it was uneventful, but mentioned that we had recorded a real whopper in the journal and warned him not to take the exit. We had marked it was complete crapsville. He got really excited, and we all wondered why. He had actually said before, "I hate eating, it takes too much time and gets in the way of me living my life," so our less than stellar review certainly wasn't the motivating factor. He told us he thought we had eaten ghost food and that the people in the diner were vampires. He went on about it for about 10 minutes, making my sister uncomfortable, so my mom tried to reason with him and steer him away from the idea. We argued that the food had no reason to taste bad. They could have easily harmed us, and nobody could recall ever seeing a movie where the wound left by whatever turned someone into a vampire was still visible on their body. He calmed down and eventually dropped the subject. Race weekend was over, and it was time to drive all the way back. He asked if I wanted to ride with him since he had driven alone on the way there. I said sure. About 2 hours into the drive, he pulled off. I thought it was odd because we had eaten a huge breakfast before leaving, and I knew he was anti-eating. At first, I didn't recognize the exit from the other direction, but eventually it clicked. He was going to the diner's exit. He wanted to see it for himself. He stopped to pay the toll, didn't mention our story, and asked if there was a diner at the exit to make sure he had the right one. The toll attendant said there had been one, but it had burned down. Well, there weren't any vampires. But what a coincidence. We had just eaten there, and within the span of 2.5 days, it had a freak accident. This intrigued him almost as much as the supernatural angle, and I was 100% on board with checking it out. We drove over to the exit. The strip mall was the same humdrum setup, except where we had eaten. It was just a charred mess, not like holes in it or a cartoonish wooden frame falling apart, but you could clearly see the damage. There were no vehicles, no police tape. I would have assumed they'd at least investigate it as a possible crime, and the area around it had been cleaned up quite well. We got back on the turnpike, and the same toll attendant was in the booth, which was hardly bigger than he was. My stepdad said, "I thought you said there was a diner here." The guy replied that there had been one, but it had burned down. My stepdad asked if they had figured out the cause. Was it a grease fire or something else? The attendant looked surprised. "Yet?" he asked. "Yeah," my stepdad said. "It had to have happened in the last 2 or 3 days. They didn't investigate it. It wasn't on the news." The man shook his head. "Oh, we know what happened. It was on the news when it happened, 8 years ago." It sounds ridiculous and cliché, and there are plenty of stories like it. I know what I saw, the same exit, the same distance from the road, and the same buildings except for that one. I don't expect anyone to believe me, which is why I rarely share it. There's also no way to prove it. By the time I was old enough to drive, I had moved to Florida, and I don't have the exit number anymore. It was after Somerset and before Wheeling, but that's almost an hour's difference no matter how you split it, so even that doesn't help. All I really think happened is that the place burned down while we were gone, and that toll guy was just a jerk. I don't believe it burned down years earlier, and I don't think I ate ghost food. Still, my stomach dropped, and it remains a strange coincidence, especially considering how thoroughly they cleaned up the site and how quiet everything around it was. It really did look like it had been lost to time. Story 15. When I was in 8th grade, I went on a school trip called the Louisiana Tour. It mainly involved visiting significant sites throughout South Louisiana. One of the stops was Myrtles Plantation, which is considered one of the most haunted places in the country. There are all kinds of stories about the place, but at one point, we were standing in a room as part of a larger group while the tour guide spoke. I don't remember about what. As I stood there, I began to hear what sounded like someone pressing a piano key. After hearing it a few times, I started looking around for the source. There was no piano, but the sound kept coming. I asked my friends standing nearby if they had heard it, but they said no. When I heard it again, I said, "There it is again," thinking they must have heard it too. They just looked at me like I was crazy. I went back to looking around the room. Everyone's eyes were on the tour guide except for one woman. She caught my eye, pointed at me, and then at her ear with a questioning look. I realized she was asking if I had heard it too, and I nodded. At that moment, the tour guide began telling a story about a soldier who had died there and had played the piano. Multiple guests had reported hearing him play at night. I honestly didn't know what to think, and I guess I still don't. As we were leaving the room, I spoke to the woman. She had heard the exact same thing I did, but her husband and son had not. I work at the Myrtles Plantation, and I've heard countless stories and witnessed events that visitors share with me. The creepiest one, in my opinion, involves staying overnight at the plantation, which operates somewhat like a bed and breakfast. There is a room filled with those creepy ceramic dolls. One doll in particular had been a favorite of a child who always kept it in her bed at night. The child later passed away, and the doll remained on the bed. When we began hosting guests at the Myrtles, we left the doll on the bed in her memory. The first night, someone stayed in the room. They moved the doll to get more comfortable. In the morning, it was back in the bed with its hands on the guest's throat. She came out furious, accusing us of doing something in her room, but no one had entered it at all that night. The next guest moved the doll as well, and while he was sleeping, he heard tapping on the wooden floor. When he woke up, he saw the doll on the floor, and that was exactly where the sound had been coming from. Everyone who stays in the room and moves the doll finds that it always returns to its bed. Story 16. I worked in a nursing home as an aide on a hospice unit. One night, I had 3 patients who were trying to end their lives, and my job was to make sure they were as comfortable as possible. The women who worked the floor with me at night were awesome. We always tried to make each other laugh and get through the shift as best we could. I was known for scaring them. Sometimes I'd hide in the closet of a room where someone had recently passed and press the call light. The women would rush in to turn it off, and I'd always jump out and scare the living daylights out of them. One night, I was at the nurse's station filling out a report because I had to give a patient, Kent, some narcotics when an aide rushed in. She swore she saw my shadow on the wall, as if I were hiding and trying to scare her, but then she heard me laughing from the nurse's station. I decided to check it out since no one else was supposed to be on our floor. As I walked to the wall, I positioned myself where the light would have cast my shadow, and there was nothing. I laughed it off until the CNA started shrieking. When I turned around, a shadow seemed to rise up the wall from the ground out of nowhere. I just stared at it and said, "Oh, for heaven's sake, is that the best you've got?" Then I walked back to the nurse's station. A while later, I had to do rounds. As I walked toward a patient's room, I heard 3 knocks on the door that led to the patio outside. I saw an older gentleman dressed entirely in black. I couldn't let him in because I didn't have the access code, so I told him to hold on a moment while I got the nurse to let him in. When she and I returned to the door, he was gone. She went outside, but we couldn't find him, so I continued to the patient's room to check on him. Blood was everywhere, and the patient was on the floor, bleeding. It looked like he had tried to get up and had flopped around in his own blood. The nurse lifted him back into bed, and we cleaned him up. There was nothing more we could do, as he was DNR, except make him as comfortable as possible. I went to my next patient's room and discovered he had also passed away. He had stopped breathing. I rushed to get the nurse and pulled his file, which also indicated DNR. We called the morgue and his family while an aide and I cleaned his body. When I went back to check on the patient who had fallen, he was no longer alive. I went to get the nurse, who was understandably frustrated, as this required 2 aides off the floor and generated a lot of paperwork for her. As I walked down the hall to get linens, I saw the old man I had noticed outside earlier walking past the nurse's station. He whispered, "One more, Jackshimia, and then I'm done for the night. Just one more." I jumped. His whisper was so eerie and ran in the direction he was heading. A patient's room door slammed shut. When I ran in, she looked directly at me, took her last breath, and passed away. Her eyes were still fixed on me. For some reason, I remember her window being open, and how strange that felt. I ran to the window but saw nothing, slammed it shut, checked her pulse, and found none. The nurse had followed me and witnessed exactly what I saw. She heard the same eerie whisper. As she was coming around the corner, she swore she saw the man. I jumped up and ran after him, and like me, she saw the patient's room door slam shut before I could reach it. When I turned around, I saw the nurse standing in the doorway, and all she could say was, "I saw it too. Oh my God, I freaking saw it too." Story 17. A few weeks ago, my girlfriend and I were sleeping together when I woke up to her saying, "What are you doing?" She sometimes talks in her sleep, but this sounded so coherent and urgent that it jolted me awake. I asked her what she was talking about, and she woke up saying she thought she saw someone at the end of the bed. Thinking it was just a dream or a semi-awake hallucination, we shrugged it off and went back to sleep. About an hour later, I woke up and saw someone standing on the bed, the sheets wrapped around their neck. I didn't know what to do, but the first thing that came out of my mouth was, "What are you doing?" My girlfriend then woke me up. I had been dreaming the exact same thing she had and said the exact same words. I know it's probably the power of suggestion, but still, screw that. Story 18. My mom had 3 kids. There's me, the youngest, and my older brother, but before either of us was born, there was Jonathan. He was a sweet little blonde boy with big blue eyes, known for accidentally repeating dad's swears in church. A wholesome kid, great in school, and active outdoors. When he was almost 6, he was riding his bike and fell, hitting his head on a rock. He got up and said he felt fine. The next morning, my mom found him in his bed when she tried to wake him for kindergarten. One pupil was dilated and the other was not. She had him airlifted to the nearest hospital. During this time, Jonathan's best friend Nick was sitting at the breakfast table eating cereal. Suddenly, Nick got up and went to the door. When his mom asked him what was going on, he said that Johnny was calling for him. Nick and Johnny lived on separate blocks, but they weren't allowed to cross the street without a parent yet, since they were still fairly young. They lived close enough, though, to call one another to come out to talk at their respective street corners. Nick went out to the street corner just as his mother received a call from mine. Johnny had just passed away in the hospital from a brain aneurysm triggered by the fall. Nick's mom could hardly handle the news and was now wondering where her son had gone. Nick came back a few minutes later and said he had heard Johnny calling to him, but when he looked, Johnny wasn't at the street corner. Then he sat down and continued eating his cereal. When his mom asked what Johnny had said, Nick replied that he had come to say goodbye. My mom told me this story when I was young, and it has stayed with me ever since. I wish I could have met him. I am thankful for the chance I was given to live, and sometimes I feel like he passed away for me, since my mom had only wanted 2 kids. I'm not religious, but I do feel something spiritual when I think of Johnny. It's scary to think of a little trigger in your brain, just waiting to be set off to kill, but my parents said that if they had known, Johnny wouldn't have gotten to do all the fun things he ended up doing, playing baseball, climbing trees, and just being a kid. And that, they said, would have been like having no life at all. Story 19. Around the time I was 19, I was deployed to Iraq. My unit worked with bombs, and honestly, I didn't know if I would make it home intact. About halfway through my tour, the Red Cross notified my unit that my father was terminally ill. Within a week, I was on a plane back to the States. My dad being ill was something I had grown used to. He was strong, and I never expected to actually lose him. I had lost my mother when I was 7, and my father's lungs had collapsed shortly before then. He was on oxygen and needed a wheelchair to get around. He took medication by the handful every few hours, gained weight from limited movement, developed diabetes, and had already beaten cancer once. I never expected to lose him. He wasn't the type to ever give up. I arrive home and head straight to the hospital. He assures me he's fine and that they're overreacting. I visit him every day while I'm there, but he insists he'll be fine by the time I return for good. Reluctantly, I go back overseas. Whenever I have a few free minutes and access to a call center, I call the hospital to check on him. My deployment finishes, and he keeps his promise. He comes home from the hospital saying he doesn't want to pass away there, but he worsens again and is readmitted. The family visits constantly, but we all know he isn't improving. One day, I'm at home when the phone rings. It's an unknown number, so I don't answer. It goes to the answering machine and a raspy voice mumbles, "Call the hospital." It's my dad. I grab the phone, but by the time I do, he's already hung up. I called the hospital immediately. They tell me he's been intubated for the past couple of hours and has just gone into cardiac arrest. He's non-responsive, and they say we need to come say our goodbyes. I argue that he just called me, but they insist that's not possible. They've been working on him for some time already. I hung up and shared the news with my family. My sister and I stared at the answering machine, replaying the tape over and over. That was the last time I ever heard my father's voice. I'm a skeptic. I don't believe in the paranormal or ghosts, and yet I cannot come up with any logical explanation. Even now, thinking about it brings tears to my eyes. Story 20. About 5 years ago, some friends and I went camping at Oconee State Park in South Carolina. We were in high school and went with our ROTC instructor, a guy in his 50s, still a beast of a man. He'd been a sergeant major in the Army, the definition of badass. The first night it was freezing, so we decided to sleep around the fire. In the middle of the night, we all woke up at the same time to a smell that made our stomachs turn, a mix of wet dog and rotten flesh. At the time, we chalked it up to damp leaves and went back to sleep. The next morning, though, the sight that greeted us was far more unsettling. Paw prints were everywhere, not just around the edges of our campsite. Some were within 4 feet of where I'd rested my head the night before. Needless to say, we were creeped out. We decided to head into town for lunch and spent the day away from the site, trying to shake off the unease. When we returned at dusk, the sense of dread only intensified. My friends and I were in the back of the truck, driving down the gravel road to the site. Suddenly, Sergeant Major slammed on the brakes, and we came to a stop in the middle of the road. We all jumped up and leaned over the cab to see what it was. Standing in the road was a hairless animal, around 50 pounds, on its hind legs. It walked to the side of the road, still upright, and let out a terrible screech. Then it darted into the woods, leaving us frozen in fear. A moment later, we smelled it, the same awful stench from the night before. We climbed into the cab, and I saw Sergeant Major like I had never seen him before. I was terrified. The creature had shaken him to his core. We drove back to the site in complete silence. When we arrived, he told us we were leaving and to pack everything up. None of us has returned since, and Sergeant Major has forbidden ROTC from using that site again. We agreed that what we saw looked like a mix between a bobcat and a coyote, but it walked like a bear on its hind legs. We named it the coyote. A few friends who hadn't heard the story decided to go up there one day and said the entire area gave off a really creepy vibe, so they left. After I told them the story, it sealed the deal. None of us will ever go back. Story 21. When I was younger, my family was extremely poor and lived in a very old mobile home on land my grandpa owned. The property was in a tiny, isolated town in the middle of nowhere in Texas, surrounded by woods. The town was your typical small country town. Football was king, and on weekends there was little to do but get drunk or high. It was also the early 1990s, a time and place where people generally didn't worry much about locking doors or setting alarms. Our trailer had 2 bedrooms, and my parents, always putting us kids first, slept in the living room on a fold-out couch. My room was directly connected to theirs, while my sister's room was down a hallway past the kitchen and bathroom at the other end of the trailer. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, my dad was awakened by the sense that someone was in the room. He looked around and saw a large male figure sitting in the easy chair just a few feet from the bed. My dad quickly flipped on the light switch beside him and saw that it was a neighbor from down the road named Carter. Carter was known as a frequent drug user and often ran into trouble with the law because of it. My dad asked him what the heck he was doing there and told him to leave. Carter replied, "I can't get out. The demons are chasing me, and your house is the only safe one." My dad, who is a fairly large and intimidating man, told him that if he didn't leave immediately, the house would be a lot less safe for him. Carter pleaded, "If I leave, they'll get me. They've been chasing me all night. If they catch me, I won't live." My dad insisted there were no demons, but warned that if he didn't get out of his house, he wouldn't survive. From what I've been told since I was asleep, my mom also added a few threats. Though not big in stature, she was equally terrified, and I believe it was her anger that finally scared him off. My dad got up and locked the door, watching through the blinds as Carter, realizing he couldn't outrun the demons, decided to steal our old beater Suburban, which my dad always left the keys in. He drove around for about an hour. We called the police, who took roughly that long to arrive since the closest station was 20 to 30 minutes away. Carter eventually returned the vehicle, was arrested, and taken to jail. He was deemed mentally unstable and ended up confined to a mental institution. The scarier part is that for years afterward, we would get phone calls where all we heard was music with lyrics like, "I'm going to end you." These calls continued for years and seemed to follow us from house to house. Even though we always had different numbers and sometimes lived in different states, we always assumed it was him sending a message. The calls stopped when I was 12. I later learned that around that time, Carter decided the best thing he could do for himself was to end himself. Story 22. My sister and her boyfriend, now husband, were house-sitting for my brother-in-law's uncle. The uncle was elderly and beginning to lose his faculties. He rents out a basement suite, where a nice lady lives. She cleans the house when she is there, but he wanted my brother-in-law to check on things and feed his old cat from time to time. On the first day they went to house sit. They arrived but couldn't find the cat. My sister has cats herself and knows they often hide when they are unwell, so they were both worried and searched everywhere. Every room, under every bed. They even asked the lady who lives downstairs, but she hadn't seen it either. My sister opened the closet in the spare bedroom and started looking through things on the floor. After moving a few items, she noticed a set of feet on the ground in the closet, with clothes covering everything above the feet. The toes were nicely painted and looked human, but she assumed it was a doll or something. They checked a few more places, and suddenly the cat appeared in the middle of the living room, just hanging out. They locked the deadbolt and left. My sister and her boyfriend went out for dinner and a movie, but she couldn't stop thinking about the feet and how real they had looked. She had only recently started dating him and didn't want to seem crazy, so she kept it to herself at first. A few hours into the night, she decided she needed to tell him. He figured it was probably just a doll, but offered to go back and check anyway. When they arrived, my sister stayed on the patio, too scared to go inside. Seeing her reaction, he realized that this must be something serious. They went to open the door, but the deadbolt was now unlocked, while the handle remained locked. He started thinking that someone might be inside. Near the door was a fireplace, so once he got in, he grabbed the sharp poker from the fireplace tools and cautiously approached the closet. He opened the closet and saw the same set of feet with painted toenails on the floor. He lightly poked them with the fire poker, and the toes scrunched up. Then he struck the foot as hard as he could with the poker and yelled, "Get out of there!" Out stepped a woman in her mid-30s, holding the cat and a can of Coke. It turned out she was friends with the basement tenant. When she became homeless, the friend let her stay with her, but then discovered she was addicted to powder. She began leaving powder around the house and having shady people come over, so the friend kicked her out. Somehow she obtained a key to the upstairs and had been staying there while the uncle was away. The police were called and she was arrested. Story 23. When I was about 5 years old in the early 1990s, I was featured in a St. Jude's Survivor newsletter. The newsletter was distributed across the country and apparently even reached Canada. A man named Mitchell called my family out of the blue after reading my cancer survival story. He lived somewhere in Canada and claimed to be a devout Christian, wanting to talk to me about God and prayer. For some reason, my mom let him. It turned out that all he really wanted was to talk to me about Al F. This Canadian man was obsessed with Al F and somehow got hold of our mailing address, sending me tons of Al F merchandise, coloring books, pencils, everything. For some reason, my parents allowed him to call whenever he wanted, since they bought into his religious talk and liked the fact that he sent me all the Al F stuff. This went on and off for about a year until one day he asked me if I had ever heard of John Wayne Gacy. He told me who Gacy was and claimed that he had escaped him when Gacy tried to kidnap him as a child. He said I should tell my parents not to trust strangers because you never know who you could really be talking to. I remember that he didn't sound menacing, just calm and matter of fact. Of course, my parents freaked out when I told them and changed our phone numbers, even contacting the police. Nothing really came of it since the man lived in Canada and hadn't actually threatened me. Keep in mind, though, that Mitchell somehow had our mailing address and knew exactly where we lived. We were planning to move soon anyway. Fast forward 10 years to around 2001. We lived in a new house, in a new state, with everything unlisted. I was now 15, and what arrived in the mail, yes, you guessed it, a freaking ALF coloring book. Story 24. When my boyfriend Bob was about 8 to 10 years old, he started receiving calls on the house phone from a mysterious man. The calls always came when Bob was home alone, before his older brother, who was 3 years older, returned from school, and while his parents were at work. The man would curse at Bob, telling him to shut up and to do whatever I say. He claimed to know where Bob lived, where his parents worked, and that he was alone. He threatened that if Bob told anyone about the calls, he would harm Bob or his parents. Terrified and just a kid, Bob complied. He hasn't told me the full extent of the stranger's demands, and honestly, part of me really doesn't want to know. Bob kept entertaining the caller for some time, until one day his older brother came home and saw him on the phone. Curious, his brother asked who it was. After getting off the phone, an apprehensive Bob finally explained the details of the mysterious caller. The next day, Bob's older brother came home early for the call. With a few friends on speakerphone, he told the man to shut up and warned that they would find him, and with their posse, make his life a living hell. Bob grew up in a predominantly Italian neighborhood where mob life was very real. After that confrontation, the calls stopped, and Bob was never harassed again. It makes me wonder whether the guy on the phone was someone from the neighborhood or some random person across the country who got a thrill from making these calls. Bob hasn't gone into much more detail about the nature of the calls, and everything I've shared is all the information he's given me. It's scary to think about. Was he just a random selection from the phone book or someone who could literally watch him from a window? It gives me the heebie-jeebies, especially since we now live in the same house where he received those calls, and there are some pretty creepy people around here. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.